All right, so here in chapter 7, we're going to talk about the interaction between the mind and the brain. And for a lot of people, they don't understand that there is a difference between the mind and the brain. So we're going to take a look at a couple of necessarily dichotomous views of this issue. And then we'll talk a little bit about some philosophical issues behind it, and also the way that we explain behavior based on our view of the interaction between our mind and our brain. So let's take a look at some learning objectives for this chapter. We're going to explain your own philosophical position on the mind-brain question. So at some point, either through in-class lecture or a discussion board, you'll be explaining what you think about that or using examples to identify it. Explain how assumptions affect the way we approach a psychological question. So there will be something in here about some kind of theoretical assumption we have about people based on the connection between the mind and the brain that we purport. And we'll look at how various methods are used to study the brain and how it processes information. And then we won't do it during this lecture, but part of this chapter is a look at a question about the mind actually leaving the body from different perspectives. It'll include cultural perspectives. We're going to look at more the nuts and bolts of that argument here, and not so much about the application, but for sure you can take a look at that additional reading and apply some of the thoughts that we'll talk about here to that. So let's start off with what do you think, again, because sometimes these are these rhetorical questions, but what do you think? Do ghosts really exist? And maybe a sub point to that is, if they do exist, how or why do they exist, and what is their essence? Where do they come from? Okay. And then you might also lead into another question once we learn more about it is, if you believe in ghosts, do you ascribe more to a dualism or a monism view? Okay. So another thing to think about is, how can an amputee experience pain in a foot or a hand that is not there? Sometimes we call this phantom pain. So how did they experience pain there? And are there some scientific explanations for it? Are there some ways that our minds make sense of things that are different than what our body perceives? And if that's the case, what gives? 3, imagine a purple strawberry with yellow spots. So how can your mind think of something that does not physically exist? Is it a matter of creativity, or is there something else? And then when a person has an out-of-body experience, has the person's mind really left the body? Okay, and what would it mean if it did? That's kind of my addition to that. So those are some what do you think type things. None of them really have a lot of answers that we can sink our teeth into right now, but we are going to take a look at some of the philosophical positions that will help us to answer questions such as those. So philosophically, what are some of the positions on the mind-brain question? So when we talk about philosophically, this is kind of theoretical or based on what people have thought over long periods of time. So when we look at that, what do you think, the practice thinking questions from above, they do raise questions about how our mental experience is related to our physical operation in the brain. So the mind-body or the mind-brain question is about what is the relationship between our consciousness, what we're aware of, what we think of, and the body that we're in. Is there some kind of consciousness that is separate from that? Is our consciousness completely tied into the way that our brains process information and the way that neurons fire and that our synapses get excited for certain things and not for others, and the different kinds of cells that are in our brains? Is that all part of it? Or is that a function of how we survive, and that there is something else that helps us? Like, how do we measure creativity? Or how do we come up with a picture in our minds of something that doesn't exist, that we've never seen before? Okay. So when we think of the mind-brain question, we have to think about subjective experience and thinking. So subjective, again, is a matter of what I perceive to be true about something, versus objective, which is about what is the truth of something that's measurable and quantifiable and empirical, something that we can actually touch and feel. So let's keep going and look at some of the differences between the different philosophies on the mind-brain question. So the first one is dualism. And dualism suggests that there is a separate entity for the mind and the brain, that the mind is kind of equivalent to a soul, and it's this kind of amorphous thing, this intangible thing that each person has that is able to be creative and to have ideas, and there's some willfulness, and the emotions are there, kind of part of that soul. And what happens there is that there are people that are called interactionists who believes that they are different from one another, the mind and the brain, but they interact together somehow, that there is an interface there. And these interactions are governed by some kind of need for the soul to be, or the mind. I keep saying soul and mind interchangeably. That might be a little bit of a bias that I have, but there's a combination and interaction of the mind in terms of what it wants to do, the willfulness and the emotions, and the brain's ability to carry out those things in the body, corporeal, so in the body, the corpus. Excuse me. So, who are people who are likely to be mind-brain dualists? Christians and people of other Western religions tend to believe that the soul leaves the body at death. There are other religions too, but those are the typical ones that you'll see in Western culture. And what that suggests is that there is a soul that's kind of in the body, and it is the body acts as a temple for that soul, and it will carry out the wishes of the soul. Okay. Other people who are dualists, those people that believe in paranormal phenomena such as telepathy and ghosts, those people believe that that there is a way to transmit some kind of psychic energy in the case of telepathy to somebody else or something else. And then people who believe in ghosts also believe that there are disembodied spirits or souls out there, and those will be separate from some kind of body. So there is a clear distinction there between the body and the mind, and in that case, the mind or the soul or the spirit of somebody can be distinct from the body. And those people will tend to be dualists. And mind-body dualists have been around for a really long time. And dualism tended to be the dominant thought because it was a way to explain something that couldn't be scientifically measured, in civilization dating back as far back as cave times. So if you couldn't explain it, then people would come up with an explanation, which again is why we talk about critical thinking, because we need to do better than just to explain something. We need to have a good foundation for it. But people would explain why something was happening and with lack of scientific evidence for it. And those people tended to come up with different ideas or stories or folklore that explained it, and usually included things like the difference between the mind and the body. Now, in contrast to dualism, we have monism. And if dualism means the belief in two things, then monism means the belief in one thing. So monism is where people believe that the mind and the brain are one, but they appear to be different somehow. So if I come up with something creatively, my mind and my brain work together to do it, but it looked different than what would be perceived through some kind of scientific method of measuring brain activity. So while I could see in my brain using adequate scientific instrumentation that my brain were excited about something and I had a creative thought, it wouldn't be able to tell me how I created that thought. Think of something like a dream, where people who believe in monism are people who would say that dreams are interesting in that they are a way of your mind reconciling some kind of synaptic firing, and that kind of explains away the idea of some kind of difference between the mind and the brain, is that is a combination and is an inseparable combination, but your mind has a way of integrating the information that's coming from the brain into a story. But yet that function is still part of the brain itself. It's not something completely different. they're both material. So what would happen is that somebody would believe that, yes, you had a dream and it can be explained, but it can be explained from some kind of material that came from some kind of synaptic production in the brain. It's not this soul that's this intangible kind of spiritual type thing. And then as opposed to materialists or physicalists, there are idealists who believe that every mental state is connected to a brain state and that they're inseparable, but they always correspond with one another. So there's a little bit of a distinction there in that materialists believe that the mind and the brain are inseparable, but they have it's almost compartmentalized to where the brain and the mind can behave simultaneously, but there isn't always a distinct connection between them. Little bit of a gray area there in terms of the explanation, but it's difficult to explain the materialist compared to the idealist when you're talking about mental states among both of them. Okay, so essentially, if you want to think of materialists, those are the people who think that all mental activity is a function of the brain, whereas idealists believe that all brain functioning is a function of mental processes. If that helps. Most of the people out there who are materialists tend to be these cognitive scientists, neuroscientists, and psychologists. That's not to say that some people in those groups aren't dualists, who are outside of monism, but they tend to be reductionist, meaning that people who are materialists tend to believe that if we knew enough about the physical processes that go on in the body, we'd be able to explain all the mental states, and that there isn't this soul, that there isn't a spirit necessarily. It's that everything is explainable through physical means. We just don't have the technology to observe it yet. So it's really tricky because there are, when we think of all the neurons that we have in our brains, you can't map them all. So we'd have to work really hard to figure out a way to map all these things, to figure out why we dream a certain way or why some people are creative and some aren't. But the goal of the reductionist is to eventually reduce things down to these component parts that we could use in combination to replicate the way that we think. And it's a mighty tall order to do, that's for sure. But the reductionists do believe in that theory. And again, it's even though it's scientific, it's still theory, because until we actually reduce things down to their component parts, we can't always know what the role of each individual part of the brain is or how to map a dream onto a certain part of the brain. Now, we do know where dreams kind of take place in the brain based on fMRIs and things like that, but we can't know, why we dream in color sometimes or not in color or in a different language or whatever. That's the tricky part. Which is why it's so appealing for people who believe in dualism to say that, well, we have this spirit that is intangible that we can't account for. It's infinitely creative and it just does it. It's easier to say that for a dualist, and a materialist or a monist would be like, well, yeah, but that's too easy of an explanation. There has to be some kind of physical reason why that is happening. So you can kind of see the difference between the people who believe in dualism and those who believe in monism. As opposed to materialism, we have functionalism. So, and there are people that are monistic who are functionalist, who believe that even though there is a mind-brain combination that's inseparable, that they aren't trying to reduce every mental process down to a component part, but that they believe that certain parts of the mind and brain do different things. So the mind is broken down into its function. And they're less concerned about how the brain operates in relation to the mind, but they're still interested in the function of, let's say, a dream, or the function that creativity has, or the function that language has. And they're not interested in like breaking down to component parts and figuring out and reducing it to its smallest little bits. So again, the materialists want to break things down into their component parts. The functionalist wants to know what the function of each aspect of the mind-brain connection is. So functionalists are cognitive scientists, but they're not looking for brain-based explanations. There might be psychologists who want to know about behavioral functioning and things like that. They're not interested in maybe a medical reason for why something is happening. There might be a more psychological reason for why something is happening. Okay. So we've gone over a couple of major philosophies in just a short amount of time. Again, if you want a little more clarification, you can refer back to the text. But the general idea there is that there are people who believe that the mind and brain are inseparable, the monists. There are people who believe that the mind and the brain are two separate things, and that the brain is this physical thing that's governed by a physical world, and then the soul or the spirit or this intangible other aspect is able to kind of transition between the brain and some kind of other mental state fluidly, and that they're not connected, but they work in tandem. Okay. So that leads us into how assumptions can affect the explanations of the mind and behavior. All right, so here's a problem. We've talked about this before, but there was a cult called Heaven's Gate that believed that they could be taken early from their bodies and be given a place in heaven ahead of some kind of awful demise, and that they would be spared. So they would free their spirits up, and they would leave their bodies, and their spirits would be made safe in the alien spaceship. All right. They also believed that they were telepathic, and that they communicated with the aliens, which again is this mind-brain dualism issue. What happened? There was a lot of people died because of it, because of what they believed, and this is a tricky thing because a lot of religions use mind-brain dualism as an explanation for what happens in the afterlife. And most people aren't killing themselves because of it, but it can turn deadly and problematic when you're part of a cult. So if you're part of a cult, watch out for that. So in terms of research, what happens is that mind-brain dualists can't oftentimes, using conventional scientific inquiry, explain the difference between the mind and the brain. All right, they can't. It's not difficult to identify the aspects of the brain, the physical brain, but what they find a hard time doing is explaining how the soul works and how they can identify different aspects of the mind, and how they can identify scientifically that it is different from the brain. It's almost like an untestable hypothesis, where you're not able to form a hypothesis and that you lose falsifiability. What happens generally was that materialists and functionalists, people who believe in monism, the inseparable nature of the mind and brain, don't have a hard time explaining the connection between the mind and the brain, but oftentimes cannot explain the things that don't appear to be testable. What usually happens with people who are monist or people who are materialist, they tend to look at any kind of negative result or unconfirmed result as having not enough information, or an inability to measure something that they ought to. So it kind of swings both ways. The dualist will say, well, it's hard to measure because it's not measurable. And the materialist will say, well, we should be able to measure it, but we don't have what we need to measure it. Again, that's kind of a reductionist mentality, is that everything has an explanation. We just may not have the scientific equipment in order to identify what the explanation is. So a couple more assumptions. Reductionist, again, ignore the important mental experiences that come from the operation of the brain. They don't like the idea of the brain made him do it defense, meaning that people, they don't believe that the insanity plea is a reasonable thing, that you can't separate the person from the mind, especially when they commit a crime. So we tend to look at the mind and the brain inseparably in that way. And behaviorists, to throw them in there, they don't look at mental processes much at all. They just want to look at what can be observed physically in terms of overt behavior. So there are some tricky aspects about both being reductionist, which again is a function of that materialism, and also being somebody who believes in mind-brain dualism. each has its issues, right, in terms of explaining what's going on. One says that we shouldn't be able to explain these things because they're not explainable in terms of mental processes and the things that are inexplicable according to mind-brain dualists. And the reductionists say that there are things that we can't explain, but we should be able to. But if we can observe it with adequate technology, then we should be okay. And then behaviorists say it doesn't matter. If we can't observe it, then it's not important. So there, that might be an overstatement, but there we go. So how can we then look at these things that seem to have no explanation? The good news is that over the last 100 years or so, we've gotten some really good scientific technology that's been able to understand and observe these phenomena that we prior couldn't. One of the things that we have found out as a function of scientific inquiry is localization of function. We have been able to find that some aspects of the brain are responsible for different forms of behavior and mental processes, which is score one for the materialist. They really like the fact that you can start mapping these things. But that doesn't mean that the mind-brain dualists lose anything, because it is important for us to be able to know where mental processes happen. And again, this is not really a win or lose situation. It's just a matter of how do we figure out where we can find different levels of brain functioning relative to the mental process that is purported to be caused by it. So I say that if any time we can work collaboratively with among two different philosophies, we're doing a good thing. An example from localization of function is the Broca's area. We've talked about Broca's area, and that we found that if we have some kind of area in the brain, like the Broca's area, that has some kind of a deficit, an impact, a lesion, whatever, and it lacks functioning, then that person might have a difficult time speaking because the words that they're saying are not coming out the right way, and it distracts the speaker. Same thing in the Wernicke's area. If you have a Wernicke's area deficiency or lesion, then the person who is speaking will speak unintelligibly, but they won't recognize it because that feedback loop is broken, which is what the Wernicke's area is responsible for, is understanding spoken and written language. So we found that we have localization of function, which is great for functionalists, because now functionalists understand that, there's a place where mental processes happen. Great. And reductionists can say, good, we're starting to figure out where these things are happening. Now we can figure out what the component parts are looking like. And the mind-brain dualists are saying, that's fine. We still can't explain these other things that are a part of the soul that are going to remain inexplicable. So it's kind of this win-win-win all the way across. So one of the ways that we support the idea of localization is that we find things through brain damage. One of the fun things about psychology is that most of what we know about psychology is because something went wrong in people's brains. When a brain is functioning normally, we don't have any evidence that there's anything wrong. It's hard to find where things are happening. But if someone gets cracked on the forehead and then they start having emotional dysregulation because they have a limbic system dysfunction and they lose executive functioning, then we know, someone getting cracked in the forehead means that there's probably something on the other side of that skull, like the forebrain, that is responsible for executive functioning. Or if somebody gets whacked in the side of the head, then they might have some kind of Broca's deficiency. Or if they get hit in the back of the head, maybe they have visual impairment because they got hit in the occipital lobe where the visual cortex does its work. Okay? So we recognize that based on trauma to the brain, there are certain areas that are responsible for doing some function. We can do electrostimulation of the brain to see if we can get different kinds of functioning from them. A couple cool studies. They've been able to stimulate different parts of the brain. It's really through transmagnetic stimulation, so I'm kind of blending these two together. But you can achieve the same results with both. Electrostimulation tends to be more probe-based and transcranial. Magnetic stimulation tends to be more using a wand. It's a least it's a least invasive intervention. You just basically hold a magnetic wand over a part of the brain, and you can start making people's hands do different things, triggering different fingers and their elbows and their shoulders based on where this stimulation is occurring. And we can do a simple experiment like that and find that there are different areas of the brain, even broadly, that are responsible for different parts of responsible for different motor function in the body. Okay. We can also use brain scans using functional MRI. MRI is kind of one of the gold standards for identifying different regions of the brain. It's not incredibly specific, but it's pretty good. And you can do functional MRIs, meaning that it's not just a picture and a snapshot. You can look at like a video of how somebody's brain changes based on the stimulation that they're receiving. So if somebody were to see like a familiar picture, a different part of their brain would light up because it would be connected to feelings and things. Then if somebody saw a picture of somebody they didn't recognize, where they might recognize a face, which has a particular part of the brain, facial recognition, and then the other part that was connected to the emotion attached to that picture wouldn't fire. Okay. So that's all great. We're able to look at localization. The materialists are happy. They like the idea that we can start to reduce things. The functionalists are happy because they can start to see that different parts of the brain are responsible for things. And the mind-body dualists are still happy because it says that, yes, you can explain why all that is or where all that is happening and how it's happening, but not why. Not why, some things make you happy one day and not the other. We've all been there, right? We have a craving for a food one day and not another. And maybe there's a nutritional thing, whatever, but it could also be tied to, I like the idea of that restaurant. So there are still things that are inexplicable, even though we have a lot of evidence that says that things are happening, where they're happening, and how they're happening, but the why question is still difficult to work through. Okay. So as a matter of electrostimulation of the brain, we were able to map certain sites on the brain that go to different parts of the body. So we'll look at that in just a second. But what was interesting about the electrostimulation of the brain is that it did lead to what was perceived to be an out-of-body experience, meaning that the person who was experiencing the e-stim, electrostimulation e-stim, felt like that their consciousness was no longer inside of their body. Okay, so that was kind of an interesting thing, because in an attempt to identify different regions of the brain in a reductionist, functionalist type manner, they actually stimulated an out-of-body experience that's more in line with the mind-body dualism perspective. But here is what they came up with anyways from the somatosensory cortex, meaning that depending on where they were in the brain, what they stimulated, it led to different sensations in different parts of the body. So this is a look as if you are looking, this would be the midline of the brain, and it's like we're looking at somebody from the face forward, right? So this is one side of their brain. And what they found was that this is how the different sensations mapped onto those parts of the brain. So what you can see is that this is kind of almost like a homunculus, where it shows in proportion not only where things happen, but also the proportion of them. So lips are very sensitive, tongue is very sensitive. Arm and shoulders are not as sensitive. The kind of the trunk part of the body is not so sensitive, but the foot is sensitive. Genitals are, a little bit more sensitive than not. But look at how much more sensitive the thumb is than the fingers. So what they found was that not only there are different parts of the brain, but it also led to a different level of function. So this is a reductionist, like we're reducing the brain to its component parts, but also what each part of the brain functions as and how important it is. And you can kind of think of that. It's not important that your hip has a lot of feeling, but something like your lips has a lot of feeling, and it should. That's how you eat. And eating is an important skill. Using your tongue is an important skill to be able to know if something is edible or not. So that's kind of where your first ideas about importance of parts of the body comes from is here. We probably kind of knew this already just by trial and error, but this is a way to empirically validate something that we've already believed to be true. So again, transcranial magnetic stimulation. You can look at this video. There's a link that you can go to in the PowerPoint presentation. Again, I can't play this here because I'll get a copyright claim. So it's a good video, and it shows how we can stimulate different parts of the brain based on, different parts of the body based on where it's happening in the brain. Okay. And then EEG is another one where you can observe different aspects of the brain to see what the wave formats look like. We're not going to go into too much detail on that. I just kind of want to show you what that looks like. And then you can have fMRI. Again, you can follow this link and you can look at how the fMRI works. Again, it's pretty good, but it's not entirely precise. There are different regions of the brain that respond differently, and they take the oxygen particles in the blood, and that allows us to see where the activity in the brain is. But that doesn't always indicate that there is what is happening in the brain. Again, it's how it's happening and where it's happening, but not necessarily what or why it's happening. Okay, I think we're going to stop here for now. Relatively short lecture. The rest of this is about that critical reading, about can the mind actually leave the body. So if you want to read that, that's perfectly fine. Again, it's more to prompt you to use some of these ideas that we've talked about here. We have some things that we'll talk about either in class or during the discussion board, so I'll leave that for then. But if you have any questions on this, let me know. If you want to, you won't hurt my feelings. If you want to learn more about any of these methods, you can do a little bit of your own research. Please look for scholarly articles and reputable websites to be able to learn more about any of these. There are some good YouTube videos out there that are produced, so be a good consumer of information. But I think that that doing this, you'll have a lot of fun. If you were to explore more about this, it's kind of interesting. It's a little bit into the neurocog aspect of psychology that a lot of people don't get into, but here it's a safe place to do it because I'm not going to ask you any questions about it. So there. All right. Look forward to seeing what you can do with all this information. And we will see you for Chapter 8.